The sun peeked over the hills, casting soft golden light across the village. Esther lifted her bucket, steadying it on her hip as she walked to the well. The path was uneven, but her steps were firm, her mind set on the tasks of the day. She hummed a tune, her voice light against the quiet of the morning. Her parents were already in the fields, bent over rows of crops. Their movements were slow, weighed down by years of labor. Esther filled her bucket and made her way home, the weight of the water pulling against her arms, but she didn't stop until she reached the house. By the time the sun was high, Esther was at Mrs. Sophie's compound. The older woman sat on a stool, her wrinkled hands resting in her lap as Esther swept the yard. The broom swished softly against the dirt, raising little puffs of dust. "You always make this place look nice, my dear," Mrs. Sophie said, her voice warm. She adjusted her headscarf and smiled as Esther began peeling vegetables. The next day, a cloud of dust followed Michael's car as he drove into the village. He stepped out, stretching his arms before wrapping his mother in a tight hug. "Ah, my son. Look at you," Mrs. Sophie said, holding his face between her hands. "Mommy, you act like I've been gone for years," Michael teased, his smile wide. Inside, the house smelled of stew and fresh bread. Michael sat at the small wooden table, listening as his mother poured tea and began speaking. "Michael, there's a girl. Esther. She's the one who helps me here," Mrs. Sophie said, her tone serious. Michael raised his cup to his lips. "I've heard about her, Mommy. You talk about her every time. She's different, my son. Respectful, hardworking. She would make a good wife." Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "You're playing matchmaker now?" The following morning, Esther arrived with a basket balanced on her arm. She hesitated at the door, her eyes lowering when Michael opened it. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. Michael stepped aside to let her in. "Please call me Michael." The breeze lifted strands of Esther's hair as they sat outside, talking about her life. Her hands rested on her lap, fidgeting slightly as she spoke of her dreams. "I want to go back to school," she said, her eyes bright with hope. That evening, Mrs. Sophie didn't let the conversation drop. "What did I tell you, Michael? She's not just nice. She's special." Michael leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "Marriage isn't something to rush, Mommy." Over the next few weeks, Michael couldn't stop thinking about Esther. Her quiet confidence stayed with him, and soon, he made his decision. Under the shade of a large tree, the village gathered for the wedding. Esther's simple gown swayed as she walked, her smile lighting up the crowd. Michael took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "I will help you achieve your dreams," he said, his voice steady. Esther blinked back tears. "And I will never let you down." In the city, the noise was overwhelming. Cars honked, people shouted, and the air was thick with unfamiliar smells. Esther clutched Michael's arm tightly as they navigated the busy streets. Michael kept his promise. He enrolled her in evening classes, watching with pride as she pored over her books each night. Their small dining table became a space for shared dreams. Her papers spread out as he asked questions and offered encouragement. "You're doing so well," he said, leaning over her work. Esther smiled. "It's because of you." The mornings were quiet moments of routine. Esther woke early, frying eggs and packing Michael's lunch. At noon, she would walk to his shop, her hands carrying a plate of steaming food. "Your wife is something else," a customer said, watching her place the plate on the counter. Michael grinned, his hands still greasy from the car engine he was fixing. "She's the best decision I ever made." The early morning light filtered through the thin curtains as Michael quietly moved around the kitchen. His hands worked quickly, flipping yam slices on the pan and cracking eggs into a bowl. He glanced at the clock, then at the closed bedroom door. With a small smile, he set the table, placing a steaming plate of food in the center. The door creaked open, and Esther appeared, her face tired but bright. Her books were tucked under one arm. "You're up already?" she asked, surprised. Michael wiped his hands on a towel and pulled out a chair for her. "You stayed up so late studying. You need your strength." Esther sat down, a smile spreading across her face as she took a bite. "Michael, you're too good to me." He shrugged, grinning. "You're my wife. That's what I'm here for." Weeks later, Esther stood in the middle of their small living room, staring at a printed letter in her hands. Her fingers trembled slightly as her eyes moved over the words. "You passed, Esther," Michael shouted from across the room, his joy uncontainable. He grabbed her hands and spun her in a circle, laughing. Her laughter joined his. "I can't believe it. I'm going to university." On the day of registration, Michael walked beside her, his hands steady on her lower back as they passed through the massive university gates. Students moved in every direction, their chatter filling the air. "Don't worry," Michael said, glancing at her nervous expression. "You'll do well." She nodded but held his hand a little tighter. "I hope so." The first few weeks were overwhelming. Esther walked through the bustling campus, her plain clothes setting her apart. Groups of girls gathered under trees, laughing and adjusting their brightly colored outfits. Esther hurried past them, keeping her eyes down. "Who dresses like that?" a voice whispered as she passed. Esther's ears burned, but she kept walking. A few days later, a girl with perfectly styled hair and sparkling earrings approached her. "Hi, I'm Margaret," she said, smiling warmly. "You're Esther, right? You're really smart. Could you help us with our assignments?" Esther hesitated but nodded. "Sure." Margaret leaned closer. "You know, we could help you too. On this campus, looking good is just as important as being smart." Margaret and her friend Sharon began handing Esther their old clothes. At first, she hesitated, running her hands over the soft fabrics and bright patterns. "Go on, try them," Sharon urged, her smile wide but sharp. "You'll look great." The girls' kindness came with a price. They often sat with Esther, their voices low and full of questions. "Your husband's a mechanic, right?" Sharon asked one day, her tone laced with mockery. "Yes," Esther replied, her voice quiet. Margaret chuckled. "So he's training you to be his secretary?" The words stung, though Esther forced a weak smile. Over time, their jabs began to wear her down. She stopped talking about Michael and started asking for more money. One evening, Michael sat at the table, counting bills in his hand. "But I just gave you money last week," he said, frowning. "I need more," Esther insisted, avoiding his eyes. Michael sighed and handed over the money. "All right, but we need to be careful. Things are tight." "Thank you," she said, pocketing the cash. She turned away, guilt gnawing at her. At the shop, Michael wiped sweat from his brow as his friend Arnold approached, a thoughtful look on his face. "Michael," Arnold began, leaning against a workbench, "how's your wife?" "She hasn't been bringing you food like before." "She's busy with school," Michael said with a proud smile. "She's working hard to help me grow our business someday." Arnold nodded slowly. "That's good, but be careful. University can change people." Michael laughed, shaking his head. "Not Esther. She's too good for that." But Arnold's words lingered in Michael's mind. He began to notice little things. Esther's simple skirts were replaced by tight jeans and colorful tops. When he asked, she brushed it off. "Margaret and Sharon gave them to me," she said. "They just want me to fit in." Michael said nothing, though his chest felt heavy. One evening, Esther sat at the edge of their bed, her hands wringing nervously. "Michael, I need more money for textbooks," she said. Michael looked up from his phone. "But didn't I just give you money for books?" "They added new ones to the syllabus," she replied quickly. Her voice wavered, but she kept her face turned away. Michael sighed, pulling out his wallet. "This is the last time, Esther. Things are getting hard at the shop." "Thank you," she said, taking the money. She slipped it into her bag, her heart pounding, but the textbooks never came. The money went instead to new shoes and dinners out with Margaret and Sharon. Esther's laughter rang out in brightly lit cafes. But at home, Michael sat alone, his dinner cold on the table. Michael sat at the dining table, his hands folded tightly as he waited. The clock ticked past midnight. The silence in the house was broken only by the occasional sound of distant cars outside. The front door creaked open, and Esther stepped in, her heels clicking softly against the tiles. She avoided his gaze as she slipped her bag onto the couch. "Group assignment again?" Michael's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Esther glanced at him briefly, brushing past. "Yes, it was a long one," she replied, her tone dismissive. The faint scent of perfume and alcohol lingered in the air as she walked to the bedroom. Michael stayed seated, staring at the door she had just closed behind her. The following weekend, Esther arrived home with Margaret and Sharon trailing behind her, their laughter echoing through the small house. Michael stood up from the couch, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Ah, welcome. You must be Esther's friends," he said, extending his hand. Esther hesitated before mumbling, This is my husband. His name is Michael." Margaret and Sharon exchanged amused glances, but said nothing. Michael's smile didn't waver as he gestured toward the seats. "Please, make yourselves comfortable. You are most welcome." As they sat down, Esther leaned closer to Michael and whispered, "Go to the kitchen and prepare something for them. They're hungry." Michael nodded, eager to be a good host. He tied an apron around his waist and began cooking. The sound of pans clanging and the aroma of frying chicken filled the air. When he emerged with plates of rice and chicken, Margaret's laughter broke the chatter. "Esther, your husband is really hard-working," she said, smirking. "But why is he dressed like a houseboy?" Michael paused, a slight flicker of confusion crossing his face. Esther let out a nervous laugh, adjusting her hair. "Oh, he just likes helping out around the house," she said, avoiding his eyes. Michael served the plates quietly, retreating to the corner as the women continued their lively discussion. The topic shifted to an upcoming party, and their laughter grew louder. Michael watched Esther, noticing how animated she seemed with her friends but distant with him. After they left, Michael approached her gently. "Esther, were you ashamed of me today?" Esther crossed her arms, leaning against the wall. "No, Michael, it's not that. You just don't understand how people think in this city. You need to improve yourself." Michael's shoulders slumped slightly. "I heard them talking about a party. I hope you're not planning to go." "Have I said I'm going? Why do you always accuse me?" she snapped, her voice sharp. Michael inhaled deeply. "I'm just trying to look out for you. I don't like the way those girls treat you. Or me." Esther rolled her eyes, brushing past him without a word. On Esther's graduation day, Michael woke early, ironing his best shirt and polishing his worn shoes until they shone. He stood by the door, holding her graduation gown with a proud smile. At the university, Michael walked beside her, his chest swelling with pride as he carried her things. As they neared the ceremony venue, Esther slowed her pace. "Michael, can you wait in the car? You don't have to come inside," she said, her tone casual. Michael froze. "Wait in the car? I came to celebrate with you. Why can't I come in?" She fidgeted, avoiding his eyes. "I'll come get you when it's time for pictures. Just wait." "Okay." Though hurt, Michael nodded slowly and walked back to the car. The heat was stifling, but he sat there, wiping his face with a handkerchief. Through the open window, he heard laughter and saw Esther posing with her friends. "Who's that man who came with you?" one girl asked. "Is he your father?" Esther laughed nervously, adjusting her gown. No, he's just my driver." Michael's heart clenched as he heard the words. He stepped out of the car briefly to stretch his legs, but quickly returned, sitting in silence until Esther came back hours later. That evening, as they sat in the living room, Michael's voice broke the silence. "Esther, why did you tell your friends I'm your driver?" Esther sighed, looking annoyed. "Why are you making a big deal out of this? It's just a small lie." "It doesn't matter." Michael leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees. "It matters to me. I've done everything to support you, and this is how you treat me." Esther waved a hand dismissively. "You're being too sensitive. Let it go." The distance between them grew. Esther began spending more time on her phone, her laughter reserved for whoever was on the other side of the screen. Michael tried to bridge the gap, sharing ideas about expanding his mechanic shop. "I was thinking of adding a spare parts section. What do you think?" he asked one evening. Esther glanced up briefly, her expression unimpressed. "Your business? It'll never grow. You're just wasting your time." Michael stared at her, stunned. "But don't drag me into your little ideas. If you want advice, pay me like the men at my company do," she added, her tone cutting. One evening, Michael walked back from the market, a bag of groceries in hand. As he approached the house, he saw a sleek black car parked outside. Esther stepped out, her laughter ringing through the air as she waved goodbye to the man in the driver's seat. Michael quickened his pace, his chest tightening. Who was that? Esther's expression hardened. He's just a colleague. Why are you acting like a jealous child? Michael said nothing, his jaw tightening as he watched her walk inside. The bathroom door creaked open, releasing a wave of steam. Esther stepped out, her skin glistening, a towel wrapped snugly around her body. She walked toward the dresser, humming softly, her mind still occupied with the events of the day. But as she reached for her phone, she froze. Michael was sitting on the edge of their bed, her phone in his hands. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his face pale with shock, anger, and betrayal. The phone seemed to tremble in his grasp as he looked up at her. Michael, Esther began cautiously, what are you doing with my phone? Give it to me. He didn't move. His knuckles turned white around the device. Smith, he muttered, the name slipping from his lips like venom. He held up the phone, the screen glowing with messages and nude pictures she had sent to Smith. You sent these to him? Her stomach dropped. She was caught. Her expression hardened, but she took a step closer. Michael, give me my phone. He stood abruptly, his voice rising, shaking with fury. This is what you've been doing? Sending pictures, these pictures, to another man? After everything I've done for you? Her eyes narrowed, her heart racing. Why are you going through my phone? What nonsense is this? Why? His voice cracked, and he jabbed a finger toward the phone, his voice thick with emotion. Because I'm your husband. I've supported you, sent you to school, worked hard for this life. And this is how you repay me? Esther scoffed, crossing her arms. I don't have time for this tonight, Michael. If you don't want me here anymore, just say it. Let me go. His chest heaved as the words hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, his mind racing, his heart in turmoil. Let you go? Is that what you want? Yes, she snapped, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. I'm done, Michael. I can't live like this anymore. A business administrator, living like this. In this house that hasn't been renovated in years? No, I can't do it anymore. Her words hit Michael like a slap. He stumbled back, as though she'd physically struck him. Where will you go? To someone who appreciates me, she said coldly. Without another word, she turned toward the wardrobe. The sound of hangers clinking, zippers opening, and her suitcase scraping across the floor filled the silence as she packed her things. Esther, wait, Michael called out, his voice trembling, but she didn't respond. She didn't look back as she opened the door and slammed it behind her, leaving him standing alone in the room. Weeks passed. Michael spent those days trying to reach her. He called, texted, and even visited places she frequented, but Esther was unresponsive. One day, he found himself standing outside a sprawling mansion, staring at the gates. His heart ached as he remembered how their lives had been before, how everything had fallen apart. Each time he tried to approach, the guards stopped him. Madam does not want to see you, one guard would say, turning him away. Michael would walk away, his shoulders slumped, his feet dragging. The pain was unbearable, but there was nothing he could do to fix what had been broken. One day, Michael spotted Esther at the supermarket. She was walking with purpose, dressed immaculately in high-end clothes. The bright lights of the parking lot glinted off her jewelry, and she moved with the grace of someone accustomed to admiration. Michael's heart skipped a beat when he saw her, and he gathered the courage to approach her. Esther, he called softly, almost hesitantly. She turned, and the hardness in her gaze was immediate. What do you want, Michael? Her voice was distant, cold. I just want to talk, he pleaded, his voice cracking. Please, Esther. Let's talk. I miss you. Before she could respond, a voice came from the car parked nearby. Everything okay, babe? Esther glanced over her shoulder, her expression softening as she saw Smith. It's fine, she replied quickly. Just some disruption. Please leave me alone. Smith stepped out of the car, his presence commanding. He placed a hand on Esther's shoulder, his cold eyes fixing on Michael. You heard her. Leave. Michael's chest tightened as the words struck him like a slap. He stepped back, his heart heavy as he watched Esther and Smith get into the car. The engine roared to life, and the luxury vehicle sped away, leaving Michael standing in the parking lot, his eyes burning with tears. Months passed, and the inevitable happened. Esther and Smith married in an extravagant ceremony. The wedding pictures flooded social media. Esther beamed, her gown sparkling, surrounded by wealth and luxury. The photos painted a picture of perfection, but Michael saw through it. He buried his heartache, channeling his emotions into his work. Then one day, Esther called him. It was the first time in months she had reached out to him. She was pregnant. "Michael, I'm pregnant," she said over the phone, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. Michael's heart dropped. A part of him felt relief, but another part of him felt a pang of sorrow. The woman he loved was carrying another man's child. The next few months were a blur of preparations. Esther's belly grew, and Smith lavished her with gifts, making sure she wanted for nothing. The luxury of it all, designer maternity wear, expensive nursery sets, was overwhelming. Still, something inside Esther felt empty. She didn't feel the happiness she had imagined. Then, one day, the labor pains hit. Esther was rushed to the hospital. She was alone. Smith had left for a business trip. She called him, her voice shaking with panic. "Smith, the baby, it's coming. You need to come home." Smith's voice was cold, even through the phone. "I'll have the driver take you to the hospital. I'm in a meeting, but I'll come as soon as I can." Esther clutched the phone, her heart sinking. The pain was becoming unbearable, and she felt completely alone. At the hospital, the doctors and nurses were frantic, but when the baby was born, silence filled the room. The doctor's eyes widened, and the nurses exchanged shocked glances. Esther's breath hitched. She reached out to take her baby into her arms, her hands trembling. But when she saw the child, her heart stopped. The baby's eyes were slitted like a cat's, its skin mottled with patches of fur. What is this?" Esther whispered, her tears falling onto the baby's skin. The nurses gasped, some of them backing away. One fainted. The room was filled with shock, and the doctor could only stare. The news spread quickly. Pictures of the baby leaked online. Whispers followed. "Is this a curse?" People murmured. "A punishment?" Later that evening, Esther returned home to the mansion. The driver handed her a letter, and her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was from Michael. "Esther, I tried to warn you. Smith was one of my customers. He told me about his first wife, Penelope. She cursed him before she died. She said any woman who marries him will share in his punishment. I didn't want this for you, but you wouldn't listen. I pray you find peace. Michael." Esther's knees buckled as she read the letter. "Is this true?" she asked the maid in a trembling voice. "Did Penelope curse him?" The maid nodded sadly. "Yes, madam. Penelope loved him, but he betrayed her. Before she died, she cursed him. Her father was a powerful witch doctor." Esther's heart shattered. She locked herself in her room that night. The whispers outside grew louder, the shame too much for her to bear. The next morning, the maid found her lifeless body. A note was left beside her. "I made too many mistakes. Forgive me, Michael." Years passed. Michael stood before a new chapter in his life, one of triumph. His mechanic shop had grown into a thriving, multimillion-dollar business. Employees greeted him with respect, his hands no longer stained with grease, but holding the reins of a successful empire. Though his heart had broken once, Michael had risen from the ashes. His life became a testament to resilience. He had built himself back up from the pain, and his story was one of redemption. No matter what heartbreak life threw at him, he had learned that with hard work, perseverance, and faith, one could rebuild and thrive. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video, and don't forget to share it with friends and family who love heartfelt tales.